He tore the papers from his lawyer's hands and dropped them on the kitchen table without looking at her. 7 years. That was all Elena Ashcroft got. 7 years of cooking his meals when he forgot to eat, of waiting in empty hotel lobbies at 2 in the morning, of learning to sleep through gunfire in the walls because Adrian Voss's world was always louder than she was. 7 years of being the woman no one in his organization bothered to remember the name of. He didn't look up when he slid the pen across the table. "Sign it," Adrian said. "My lawyer's already handled everything." Elena looked at the pen. She looked at him. This man she had loved so completely and so foolishly that she had spent years quietly dismantling threats against his life without ever telling him. She picked up the pen. She signed. No tears, no performance, nothing. And somewhere across the Atlantic, in a stone estate older than most nations, a phone rang twice before a man with silver hair and cold eyes answered it. "She signed," said the voice on the other end. The old man was quiet for a long moment. "Then bring her home," he said. "If you've ever loved someone who never once looked at you, truly looked at you, then you already know how this story ends. But you don't yet know what it costs. Stay with me until the last frame. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the stories on this channel don't give you easy answers. They give you the truth. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it really started. The morning Adrian Voss filed for divorce, the weather in the city was ugly. A gray, low-pressure sky that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to rain. The kind of morning that made the financial district feel smaller than it was, all that glass and ambition squeezed under a ceiling of dirty clouds. Adrian stood at the window of his 43rd floor office and watched the streets below like he always did, like a man surveying property. His suit was Italian, his coffee was untouched, and somewhere in the building behind him, 3 of his senior advisors were waiting with the paperwork that would formally end the quietest chapter of his adult life. He didn't feel guilty. That was the thing he noticed most. He kept waiting for it. Some flicker of hesitation, some muscle memory of the man he'd been when Elena Ashcroft walked into his life. And it didn't come. What came instead was the particular coldness of a decision already made. Clean, final. Marcus Webb entered without knocking. He never knocked. 14 years with Adrian had earned him that, or so he believed. "Lawyers are downstairs," Marcus said. He had the kind of face that aged well by staying blank. Even in moments like this, there was nothing in it. "The settlement's straightforward. She didn't contest anything." "I know she didn't." "You want to do this at the apartment?" "No." Adrian turned from the window. "Have the papers sent there. She can sign at home." Marcus nodded, and something crossed his face so quickly Adrian nearly missed it. Not concern, not sentiment, something closer to relief. At the time, Adrian filed that away and forgot it. He forgot a lot of things that morning. Potep. Elena was in the kitchen when the papers arrived. Not cooking. She'd stopped cooking the elaborate meals years ago when she understood that Adrian's schedule had no room for the kind of dinner that required 2 hours and fresh herbs. She was drinking coffee and reading, which was how she spent most mornings now. And when the courier knocked, she already knew what it was. She'd known for weeks, not because anyone told her. Adrian's world was full of men who believed women like Elena. Quiet women. Women who kept to themselves. Women who didn't demand rooms at tables they weren't invited to. Were also deaf. They talked freely around her. They made calls in hallways she walked through. They held meetings in adjacent rooms with doors that didn't close all the way. She had known about the divorce longer than Adrian had been certain of it. She read the papers carefully, not because she was looking for a way out of them, but because Elena Ashcroft had been raised to read everything placed in front of her and to understand exactly what she was agreeing to. The settlement was, as Marcus had said, straightforward. Adrian was keeping the properties. He was offering a monthly figure that was generous by ordinary standards and meaningless by hers, though he didn't know that. The legal language was airtight. She found the pen in the kitchen drawer. She signed every page. The courier left. Elena finished her coffee. She washed the mug and set it upside down on the drying rack, and then she stood at the sink for a moment with her hands braced against the edge, looking at the water still running, and she turned it off. She did not cry. She had already done that, months ago, in private, the way she did most things. There was nothing left to cry about. What remained now was something colder and more practical. She picked up her phone and sent a single text to a number she almost never used. "It's done." 3 seconds later, the reply came. "We know. The convoy leaves at 6. Gus." Adrian's inner circle met that evening at the private dining room of a club in the arts district that officially didn't have a private dining room. 7 men around a table, including Marcus Webb and a senior advisor named Dolan Fitch, who'd been with the organization for 22 years and who had, though Adrian didn't know this yet, recently accepted a wire transfer of $4.2 million from an account registered to a holding company in Geneva. The mood around the table was not celebratory, it was careful. "The divorce went through," Marcus said, because someone had to start. "Clean?" Fitch asked. She didn't contest a word of it. A man named Gregor, who ran logistics for 3 of Adrian's port operations, exhaled slowly. "Good. That's cleaner than I expected." "She's not what you all thought she was," Adrian said, and the table went quiet. He meant it as a statement of fact, not defense. "She was quiet. That's not the same thing as being a threat." No one around that table disagreed with him out loud, but Marcus and Fitch exchanged a look across the breadth of the table, and if Adrian had been watching, if he'd been watching anything other than his own reflection in the dark window behind Gregor's shoulder, he might have caught it. He wasn't watching. He was thinking about the morning meeting with a Czech shipping consortium that had been trying to push into his port territory for the better part of a year, and about a financial exposure his comptroller had flagged in the Luxembourg accounts, and about the fact that he'd slept 4 hours in 2 days. He was not thinking about Elena. He would not think about her seriously for another 16 hours. The next morning arrived and brought with it something Adrian Voss had never experienced in 14 years of running an organization that specialized in making inconvenient things disappear quietly. It brought 12 black Rolls-Royces. He heard about it from his security director at 7:43 in the morning when the man called him in a voice that had all the professional composure of someone who had just watched something they couldn't explain. "There's a convoy," the director said. "Financial district. They came in from the northern perimeter. We counted 12 vehicles, Phantom series, no plates we can run. Armed escort on foot. I'm looking at maybe 40 men, sir. Professional. Someone else's professional." Adrian was already out of bed. "Whose?" "That's the thing." A pause. The sound of the director breathing. "Nobody knows. We've been running the vehicle signatures for 20 minutes. Nothing. These people aren't in any database we have access to." "Where are they going?" Another pause. "They stopped, sir." "Stopped where?" "Outside Mrs. Voss's apartment." Adrian stood in the middle of his bedroom with the phone against his ear and the particular stillness of a man whose internal architecture has just shifted without warning. He'd built his career on reading rooms, reading people, reading the particular silence that preceded violence or betrayal. What he felt now was different from all of those. It was the specific disorientation of realizing a room you thought you knew has a door you never noticed. "Send me the feed," he said. The footage came through 30 seconds later. He watched it on his phone in the gray morning light coming through the penthouse curtains. 12 Rolls-Royces in a tight formation, blocking half a city block with the casual authority of people who didn't need to explain themselves to traffic. 40-something men in dark clothing arranged at careful intervals, not clustered the way hired muscle clustered, but placed, positioned with the geometric precision of people who'd done this 1,000 times on 3 different continents. And then the rear door of the lead vehicle opened, and the man who stepped out was not a bodyguard. He was older, silver-haired. He moved with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where everyone else was afraid and learned to find that boring. He wore a suit that cost more than some cars, and he walked to the entrance of Elena's building, and he waited. Elena came out in under 2 minutes. She was wearing dark slacks and a gray coat, and she had one bag, just one, a leather carry-all over her shoulder, and she walked out of that building like she'd been expecting this exact convoy on this exact morning. No surprise, no hesitation. The silver-haired man bowed, not a nod, not a respectful inclination of the head. He bowed. and every one of the 40-odd men standing along that street followed. Elena said something Adrian couldn't lip-read through the grainy security footage. The silver-haired man responded. She nodded once. She got into the second car. The convoy pulled out in under 90 seconds. Adrian watched the footage 3 more times. Then he called Marcus. "Who is he?" Adrian said. "The man who got out of the first car. Find me a name." Marcus was quiet for 4 seconds. That was 4 seconds too long. "I'll look into it," Marcus said. Adrian hung up. He stood at the window. The city was doing what it always did, moving, grinding, indifferent. And he stood there with a cold certainty beginning to settle into the base of his spine that told him, in the language of instinct that had kept him alive since he was 26 years old, that he had made a catastrophic error, not the divorce, the years before it. It took his intelligence team 6 hours to get him a partial answer, and partial was the word his analyst used 3 times in the briefing, apologetically, like a man admitting to a wound. "Partially confirmed," the analyst said, setting a folder on Adrian's desk that felt deliberately thin. "The man outside the building is believed to be Callum Rourke. No criminal record in any jurisdiction we have agreements with. No public profile. He surfaces in intelligence files from 6 different countries, sir. Always as a footnote. Always adjacent to operations that were never officially attributed to anyone." "Adjacent to who?" The analyst took a breath. "To the Ashcroft name." The room was quiet. Adrian opened the folder. Inside was a photograph. Rourke at what appeared to be a port facility 15 years ago, shaking hands with a man Adrian didn't recognize. Behind them, partially visible, was a flag with a crest he didn't know. "Ashcroft," Adrian said, as in the family, sir. "We believe, and I want to be careful here because our sourcing is limited, we believe Elena Voss, formerly Elena Ashcroft, is the only living heir of the Ashcroft syndicate." Adrian looked up. The analyst looked like he wished he were somewhere else. "Say the rest," Adrian said. "The Ashcroft syndicate controls is the right word, port authority leverage across 11 major shipping lanes. They have documented financial relationships with banking institutions in 6 countries that we know of. Their intelligence networks are, sir, they're older than most governments. The organization has been operating in some form for over 120 years. They don't fight. They don't threaten. They position. They've never been tied to a single open conflict because they've never needed to start one." Adrian closed the folder. He thought about 7 years. He thought about Elena sitting across from him at kitchen tables, in waiting rooms, in the back seats of cars, always quiet, always patient. And he had taken that patience for blankness, that quietness for emptiness, and he had treated her like a piece of furniture in his own house for 7 years while she carried one of the oldest and most powerful names in the history of organized influence. She never told him, not once. He pulled out his phone. He called Marcus again. Marcus answered on the first ring, which was unusual. "You knew," Adrian said. The pause that followed was its own confession. "Adrian, don't." His voice came out quieter than he intended, which was worse. When Adrian Voss got loud, people around him braced for noise. When he got quiet, they braced for something else. "Don't explain it to me like I'm an asset to be managed, Marcus. Did you know who she was?" Another pause. There were concerns about the optics, about how the other families would interpret. You knew." Adrian set the phone down on the desk very carefully without hanging up. He sat in his chair. He looked at the ceiling. Somewhere on the other end of the line, Marcus Webb was still talking. Adrian wasn't listening anymore. He was thinking about the moment Elena had walked out of that building with one bag and gotten into a car sent by the most reclusive and quietly powerful criminal organization on the planet, and done it without surprise, without drama, without a single backward glance. She'd been ready. She'd been ready for a long time. He was still sitting there 20 minutes later when his security director called again with a different kind of urgency in his voice, the kind Adrian had learned to recognize as the sound of a situation getting worse faster than anyone expected. "Sir," the director said, "there's been a shooting, one of ours." A breath. "It's Gregor, who ran logistics. Gregor, who had exhaled with relief around that table last night. "He's dead," the director said, "and whoever did it, they left a crest at the scene." Adrian already knew what crest it was going to be before the director described it. He'd just seen it in a photograph, the Ashcroft crest. The world Adrian Voss had built in 14 years was not a fragile thing. It had survived 2 hostile takeover attempts, a federal investigation that lasted 3 years and found nothing actionable, the defection of a senior lieutenant who tried to sell operational intelligence to a rival family and disappeared 6 weeks later. It had survived the violent death of his father, Harlan Voss, when Adrian was 29, a death attributed at the time to a rival's hired shooter, a death that had shaped everything about how Adrian built his empire, on paranoia, on leverage, and on the iron conviction that trust was the most expensive commodity in his world. He had given it to Marcus Webb. He had given it to Dolan Fitch. He had given it, in the ordinary daily way of long marriages, to a woman he'd never once truly looked at. One of those trusts had held. He sat in his office now at 11:30 at night, the city spread out below him in its usual indifference, and he thought about Elena Ashcroft and the particular kind of love that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't demand to be recognized, that shows up in the form of a woman who quietly, systematically, for years, does things for you that you'll only understand long after she's gone. His phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. The voice on the other end was a woman's, and it was calm, and it was Elena's. "Don't say my name," she said. "Don't trace this call. You won't find anything. I'm not calling to hurt you, Adrian. I'm calling because someone killed your man Gregor and framed my family for it, and whoever did that wants us at war. And I don't want a war. I want you to understand that." He was quiet for a moment. "You could have told me," he said, "any time in 7 years. You could have told me who you were." "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you?" The line was quiet for long enough that he thought she might hang up. "Because I wanted you to love me," she said finally. "Not my name, and you never managed either one, so it doesn't matter now." She hung up. Adrian sat with the deadline in his hand in his 43rd floor office, in the city he controlled, and the organization he'd built, and the life he'd chosen, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt the specific weight of everything he'd thrown away without ever understanding its value. Outside, a light rain had finally started to fall. The streets below went dark and wet and quiet. Somewhere in this city or beyond it, Elena Ashcroft was already moving, already thinking 3 steps ahead, already doing what she had apparently always done. And Adrian Voss, for the first time in 14 years, had absolutely no idea what came next. The rain that had started falling outside Adrian's window didn't stop. By midnight, it was coming down hard enough to blur the streetlights into long smears of orange and white, and Adrian was still in his office. But he wasn't sitting anymore. He was moving, pacing the length of the room in the specific way he moved when something was wrong enough that stillness felt like surrender. 3 steps to the window, turn, 4 steps back to the desk, turn again. His jacket was on the floor where he'd dropped it an hour ago, and he hadn't bothered to pick it up. Marcus called at 12:18. Adrian let it ring. Marcus called again at 12:22. Adrian picked up on the 4th ring and said nothing. "We need to talk about Gregor," Marcus said. "We needed to talk about a lot of things, Marcus. We're a little behind. The scene is, it's been cleaned up. Our people got there before anyone official. The crest, I know what crest. It doesn't make sense. The Ashcroft organization doesn't operate this way. They've never moved on personnel. That's not their... Stop explaining their methods to me like you haven't been lying to my face for however long this has been going on." Adrian's voice was still quiet. He'd noticed that about himself tonight. The quieter he got, the worse it was. "What else aren't you telling me, Marcus?" The line hummed. "Come to the Whitmore building," Marcus said. "There are people you need to hear from directly. Tonight." "Who?" "Fitch, and a few of the others." Adrian looked at the rain against the glass. He thought about the convoy that morning. 12 cars, 40 men, Elena getting in without looking back. "I'll be there in 40 minutes, he said. He was there in 30. Us. The Whitmore building was a squat, unremarkable structure in the warehouse district that officially housed a mid-sized freight coordination company. 3 of its basement floors did not appear on any architectural filing. The elevator required a key and a code, and the kind of patience that came from knowing the door would open on its own schedule regardless of how hard you pressed the button. Adrian went down alone. The room at the bottom was set up like a briefing space. Long table, no windows, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. 7 men were already seated when Adrian walked in, and the one at the far end was Dolan Fitch, who had been with the organization for 22 years, and whose face tonight had the careful blankness of a man who'd prepared what he was going to say. Adrian didn't sit. "Talk," he said. Fitch folded his hands on the table. "There's intelligence we've been sitting on, about Elena, about who she is and what implications that has for this organization's position. Intelligence you've been sitting on. There were reasons to wait for the right—" "How long, Dolan?" Fitch's jaw tightened. 14 months. The room had the particular silence of men who know they're in the presence of a detonation that hasn't gone off yet. Adrian pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. He put his hands flat on the surface. "You knew for 14 months that my wife was the Ashcroft heir. We believed you knew." He looked at each face around the table in turn, slowly, the way a man reads the fine print on something he should have read much earlier. "All of you." Some of them held his gaze. Some didn't. Marcus at his left was looking at the table. "The concern," Fitch said, and his voice had taken on the measured cadence of a man reciting something rehearsed, was operational. If the other families learned that the head of this organization had married into the Ashcroft bloodline without their knowledge, without any form of negotiation, the interpretation would be that you were positioning for a consolidation of power, that you were building toward absorbing the Ashcroft networks. "And that would start a war," said Gregor's replacement, a younger man named Tallis, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "It would start several," Fitch said. Adrian let that sit for a moment. "So you decided to remove the problem. We decided to manage the exposure. You pushed me to divorce her." Fitch didn't answer, which was an answer. Adrian nodded slowly. "And Gregor, did he know?" Gregor had concerns, yes. Had. Adrian looked at Fitch. He had concerns, and now he's dead, and someone left an Ashcroft crest next to his body. He paused. "Walk me through why I shouldn't be looking at everyone in this room right now." The silence that followed had texture to it. It was the silence of men calculating. Marcus spoke first. "We didn't kill Gregor." "I know you didn't," Adrian said. "You're not that stupid, but someone knew enough about this situation to use Ashcroft iconography to frame Elena, which means someone knew about the divorce, the convoy, and the specific internal tensions in this room. That narrows the field considerably." He stood up. "Find me the wire transfer that paid for Gregor's death," he said. "Not the shooter. The money. Someone in this room knows where to look, and they're going to tell me before morning because the alternative is that I start dismantling this table from the chair closest to Fitch and work my way outward." He left without waiting for a response. He got back to the penthouse at 2:40 in the morning and found his security director, a former military contractor named Reeves, sitting in the lobby with the look of a man who'd been awake for 30 hours and expected to be awake for 30 more. "We found something," Reeves said. "Say it." "The transfer that paid for Gregor's hit. We traced it through 4 intermediaries. It originated, or appears to originate, from an account connected to Ashcroft Holdings in Zurich." Reeves paused. "But the routing is wrong. The account structure is right. The naming conventions are right. But the internal codes are off by a generation. Someone built a convincing replica of Ashcroft financial architecture and used it to fund the hit." Adrian stared at him. "Someone faked an Ashcroft account and left just enough of a trail for us to find it. Not enough to trace further, enough to point the finger." "So Gregor's death is a message," Adrian said. "Not to me. To me about her." "Or to both of you," Reeves said carefully. "About each other." Adrian went upstairs. He stood at the window for a long time. The rain was still coming down. Someone was running a play against both organizations simultaneously. Someone who understood Ashcroft financial architecture well enough to replicate it. Someone who had known about the divorce, possibly before it happened. Someone who needed the Voss organization and the Ashcroft syndicate pointed at each other. He picked up his phone. He dialed the number Elena had called from, disconnected. Of course. He put the phone down. He thought about what she'd said. Someone killed your man Gregor and framed my family for it. I don't want a war. She'd called him within hours of the shooting. She'd known immediately, which meant she had people watching, people good enough to get information ahead of his own intelligence apparatus, which also meant she'd chosen to use that capability to warn him rather than to disappear. He turned that over for a long time. At 6 a.m, a courier arrived at the Ashcroft estate outside the city with a sealed envelope addressed to Elena in handwriting she didn't recognize. Her head of security, a composed, gray-eyed woman named Petra, who had been with the family for 19 years, brought it to her unopened. No prints, Petra said. No chemical trace. Whoever sent it knew we'd check. Elena opened it at the writing desk in the east sitting room with the morning light coming in cold and flat through tall windows. The estate had the specific quality of old money. Not lavish exactly, but permanent. The kind of place that didn't need to announce itself because it had been there longer than most of the things around it. The envelope contained a single photograph. It was a photograph of her grandfather. Not old, recent. Taken within the last year, she estimated, based on the coat he was wearing. He was walking through what appeared to be a private corridor somewhere, and behind him, partially in shadow, was a man she recognized. She recognized him because she had seen him around Adrian for years. Never close, always adjacent. The kind of presence you cataloged and filed away because something about him didn't fit the rest of the furniture. Lucien Voss, Adrian's uncle. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in the same handwriting as the envelope, he knows who you are. He's known for 3 years. Ask yourself why nothing happened. She sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up the phone and called Petra back into the room. I need everything we have on Lucien Voss, she said. Not Adrian's file on him, ours. Petra looked at her steadily. That will take a few hours. Then start now. Lucien Voss was 61 years old and had spent the majority of his adult life in the precise position of a man who almost had everything. He'd been present at the founding of the organization that Adrian now ran. He'd been at his brother Harlan's right hand for years before Harlan's death, a death that the official record attributed to a rival's hired shooter and that Lucien had mourned publicly and extravagantly. He'd stepped back gracefully when Adrian assumed control at 29, citing age, citing loyalty to the bloodline, citing the particular grace of a man who knows when to yield. He'd spent the decade since running a small portfolio of legitimate investments and attending board meetings and having dinner with Adrian twice a month at a private club that smelled of old wood and expensive cognac, and he'd done all of this with the patient, unshowy bearing of a man who was waiting for something. He lived alone in a townhouse in the northern part of the city that was much larger on the inside than it appeared from the street, and at 6:45 in the morning, Lucien Voss was sitting in his study with a cup of tea and a phone pressed to his ear, and he was saying quietly and without inflection, "The account trace will hold for another 36 hours at most. After that, they'll find the gap." The voice on the other end said something. "Then accelerate," Lucien said. "We need them in the same room before either of them starts comparing notes." He hung up. He drank his tea. He looked out the window at the rain. Adrian found the wire transfer at 7:15 in the morning because he found the man who knew where it was. The man's name was Coyle, and he ran accounting for 2 of Fitch's subsidiary operations, and Adrian had him brought to the penthouse not as a meeting, but as a statement. 3 of Reeves's people, no notice, no explanation, just Coyle, arriving in his office in yesterday's clothes, and the expression of a man who's been calculating the odds since his front door opened. "I'm not your enemy," Adrian told him. He was sitting behind his desk, and Coyle was standing because no one had offered him a chair. "I need one piece of information. Who authorized the transfer that paid for Gregor's death? Not the account it came from. Who authorized it?" Coyle's throat moved. "If I tell you that, you'll be in danger, yes." Adrian looked at him. "You're in danger already, Coyle. Gregor knew things, and Gregor's dead. You know things. I'm giving you the opportunity to decide which direction the risk runs." Coyle was quiet for a long moment. He was a slight man, mid-50s, the kind of person who'd spent decades making himself easy to overlook. He looked at the floor. He looked at the door. He looked back at Adrian. "I only saw it once," he said. "A routing instruction that came through Fitch's channel 2 weeks ago. I flagged it internally because the destination structure looked off, like someone had built it to look like something it wasn't. Ashcroft architecture." Coyle blinked. "You already know." "I need the originating authorization before it entered Fitch's channel." Another long pause. Coyle folded his arms across his chest, then unfolded them. The body language of a man trying on different decisions. "There was a name on the original instruction," he said finally. "Not Fitch's, older, from further up." Adrian waited. "Lucien," Coyle said. "The notation was LV and a date. I thought it was a filing error. I filed it and forgot about it." He swallowed. "I didn't think—" Adrian was already reaching for his phone. "What?" "Elena's file on Lucien." And Voss arrived at 8 o'clock, and it was 47 pages, which told her everything she needed to know about how seriously her grandfather's organization had taken him. She read it in under an hour. She read it the way she read everything, quietly, completely, with the specific attention of someone who understands that the most important information is almost always in what's been left out rather than what's been put in. What the file contained: Lucien's financial movements over the past 6 years, a pattern of contact with 3 organizations that competed with both the Voss Empire and the Ashcroft Syndicate, 2 meetings, undocumented, reconstructed from peripheral surveillance, with men who later turned up in advisory roles for those same organizations, and a single notation, 3 years old, in her grandfather's handwriting. He reached out. Offer declined. Watch him. Her grandfather had known, had reached out to Lucien directly, had turned him down, and had never told her. She closed the file. She sat with her hands flat on the cover and the morning light moving slowly across the desk. Lucien had known who she was for 3 years. He'd used that knowledge, or rather, he'd held it, like a card he wasn't ready to play. He'd watched her in Adrian's household, invisible and underestimated, and he'd waited. He'd let Marcus Webb and Dolan Fitch push Adrian toward the divorce because a war between Adrian's organization and the Ashcroft Syndicate served him. It destabilized both. It created the specific kind of chaos that a patient man could walk through while everyone else was burning. She picked up the photograph again. Her grandfather, walking a corridor, with Lucien partially visible behind him. Not a meeting. A surveillance photograph. Her grandfather knew Lucien was watching him. He'd left this in a place that someone could find and send to her. She set the photograph down very carefully and looked at Petra, who was standing at the door. "Get me a car," Elena said. "Not the convoy. 1 car, 2 people." Petra frowned. "Where are you going?" "To have a conversation I should have had 7 years ago." She found Adrian at his office. She hadn't called. She'd simply arrived, and the fact that she got as far as the elevator before his security intercepted her said something about how much internal disruption last night had caused. His people were distracted, pulling in multiple directions, and a woman in a gray coat with a leather bag and the bearing of someone who owned the building walked through gaps like that. They stopped her outside the elevator on 38. She gave them her name. She waited. 3 minutes later, Adrian's voice came through someone's earpiece, and the security man in front of her stepped aside. She took the elevator to 43. He was standing when she came in, which she noted. He'd taken off his tie and rolled his sleeves, and his hair was wrong in the way that meant he'd been awake all night running his hands through it. He looked like what he was, a man whose world had rearranged itself in less than 24 hours and who hadn't found the ground yet. She stopped a few feet inside the door. He looked at her. "You came," he said. "I have a photograph to show you." She set her bag on the nearest chair and took out the photograph and held it out. He crossed the room and took it and looked at it for a long time without speaking. She watched his face. She'd spent 7 years studying that face without letting him know she was doing it, and she could read it better than he knew. What she saw now was not surprise. It was something past surprise. The particular expression of a man who has just had a suspicion confirmed that he desperately wanted to be wrong. "Lucien," he said. He reached out to my grandfather 3 years ago. My grandfather turned him down and had him watched. Someone sent me that photograph this morning. Who? I don't know yet. Someone who wants us talking instead of shooting at each other. She paused. Your man Coyle. Is he still alive? Adrian looked up sharply. How do you know about Coyle? Because Lucien knows you'd find the wire transfer eventually, and Coyle is the only person in your organization who saw the originating notation. If I were Lucien, Coyle would already be a problem I was solving. She held his gaze. Is he somewhere safe? Adrian was already reaching for his phone. He made a short call. 4 words, a location, a name. He hung up. He looked at her. He's been moved, he said. Good. A silence opened between them. It was different from the silences she'd grown used to in 7 years of marriage. Those had been empty, the silence of a man who didn't notice her enough to fill the space. This one was dense. It had weight. You knew it was going to end, he said. The marriage. You knew before I did. I knew for a while. And you didn't leave. She looked at him. I was watching out for you. I was still doing that when you handed me papers to sign. The words landed the way she'd known they would. She watched him absorb them, watched his jaw tighten, and then deliberately release. Watched the specific effort it cost him to stand there and take that without deflecting. Lucien killed my father, he said. It wasn't a question. She could hear that he'd just arrived at it, the pieces falling into a shape he hadn't been willing to look at directly before tonight. That's what the file suggests, not proven, but suggested clearly enough that my grandfather believed it. Adrian set the photograph on his desk. He put his hands on either side of it and looked down at it. His shoulders were rigid. He's been sitting across from me twice a month for 10 years, he said, eating dinner, asking about operations, giving advice. His voice was flat, but the flatness was doing a lot of work. Offering advice. He was building toward something, Elena said. He needed your organization weakened from the inside and the Ashcroft name positioned as a threat. The divorce was part of that. It created a reason for my family to retaliate, whether or not we actually did. Gregor's death was the spark. She paused. If we go to war, both organizations are destabilized. Lucien has positioning in at least 3 competing structures. He doesn't need to win a fight. He just needs to make sure neither of us does. Adrian was quiet for a long moment. You worked all of this out from a photograph and a file, he said, and 7 years of paying attention in rooms where nobody thought I was listening. He looked up at her. The morning light was hitting the side of his face, and he looked older than she remembered, or maybe just differently tired, but not the tired of a busy man, but the tired of a man who has been wrong about something for a very long time and is only now permitted to know it. I'm not asking you to forgive anything, he said. I'm not going to do that to you. Good, she said. I'm not in a forgiving mood. I'm in a practical one. She reached back into the bag and pulled out the full 47-page file and set it on his desk. His financial movements, his contacts, the 3 organizations he's been feeding. It's not complete. Our surveillance had gaps, but it's enough to know where he's been positioning assets. Adrian looked at the file. He looked at her. Why are you giving me this? Because if Lucien starts a war, people die. People who have nothing to do with any of this. People in the ports and the routes and the institutions that both our families have been using for protection instead of destruction. She held his gaze. And because whoever sent me that photograph wants us working together, and I think they might be right. Adrian picked up the file. He opened it. He read the first page, and then the second, and then he stopped on the third where a transaction record was annotated in her grandfather's handwriting, and his face changed. Something in it going very still in the way that preceded serious action. This is from 2 weeks before my father died, he said. Yes. Lucien transferred. Yes. He closed the file. He set it down. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment, just a moment, the only concession to feeling he'd allowed himself in the last 12 hours. And then he dropped his hands and his face was composed again. And Elena watched the grief and the rage and the long-deferred truth move through him like weather through a building. What do you need from me? He said. Access to your Eastern Port records for the last 3 years. If Lucien has been routing material through your channels without your knowledge, there'll be a pattern. And what do I need from you? My family's intelligence on the 3 competing organizations he's been cultivating. You'll want to know what he promised them. He nodded slowly. He extended his hand. She looked at it. She looked at him. She didn't take the hand. Instead, she picked up her bag and turned toward the door and said, I'll have someone send the files by noon. Don't bring Marcus into this, not yet. I know, he said. And Adrian. She paused at the door without turning back. Lucien knows we're talking. He's been ahead of this situation from the beginning. Whatever he's planning next, it's already in motion. She left. Adrian stood in his office in the gray morning light with a 47-page file and the photograph and the wreckage of everything he'd believed about the last decade. And he looked out at the city, and he thought about a 61-year-old man sitting in a townhouse across the city, drinking tea and waiting with the patience of someone who had already made his move. His phone rang. It was Reeves. Sir? Reeves said, and his voice had that quality again, the one that meant worse. Coyle's been moved. He's secure. A breath. But we just lost contact with 2 of our people in the Southern Logistics office, the ones who had access to the port records. Adrian closed his eyes for half a second. And the records? He said. Gone, Reeves said. Servers wiped. Someone knew exactly which drives to pull. Lucien was already moving. And somewhere in the city, the 3 organizations he'd been quietly feeding for 3 years were about to receive instructions that would make the next 48 hours the most dangerous either family had ever faced, from a man who had spent a decade eating dinner twice a month and offering advice and waiting, with the particular patience of someone who had already decided how this ended, and had never once intended for either of them to walk away from it. The port records were gone, and 2 men were missing, and Adrian Voss had exactly 1 move left before Lucien closed the remaining gaps. He made it in under 4 minutes. He called Reeves back and gave him 3 names. Men outside the main organization, people who didn't appear on any chart that Fitch or Marcus or Lucien would have access to. Men Adrian had maintained quietly, the way you maintain a fire escape. Not because you expect to need it, but because you've spent enough time in burning buildings to know the difference between planning and hoping. Consolidate the southern operation to the Kelvin site, he said. Pull everyone who isn't essential out of the main building. I want the exposure reduced by half before noon. And the missing men? Keep looking, but don't stop moving while you look. He hung up. He picked up the 47-page file and put it inside his jacket, close to his body. And he left the office without telling anyone where he was going. 2. The Kelvin site was a converted industrial space 40 minutes outside the city that officially processed commercial refrigeration equipment and unofficially served as the nerve center Adrian used when the main operation was compromised. He'd built it 7 years ago after a close call with a federal surveillance unit, and he'd told exactly 4 people it existed. Lucien was not one of them. He arrived at 10:40 in the morning to find Reeves already there with 6 of his most trusted people and a technical setup that had been assembled in under 2 hours. The space smelled of concrete and machine oil, and the particular tension of professionals working fast under pressure. We pulled what we could from the backup channels before the servers wiped, Reeves said, walking Adrian through the room. Screens lined one wall, half of them dark, the active ones showing financial data and map overlays. The port records are gone, but the wipe was too clean. Whoever did it used a specific erasure protocol that we've seen before. Where? Reeves pulled up a file on the nearest screen. 8 months ago, a competitor of ours in the eastern shipping lanes had their financial records wiped ahead of a hostile acquisition. Same protocol, same gap in the audit trail. He looked at Adrian. The acquisition was completed by a holding company registered in Cyprus. The holding company's beneficial owner is obscured through 4 layers. But the legal firm that did the registration has a relationship with Lucien's investment portfolio, Adrian said. 3rd firm on the left, yes. Adrian looked at the screen. He thought about sitting across a dinner table twice a month for 10 years. He thought about advice. All the specific, detailed, well-considered advice that Lucien had offered over the years about which operations to expand and which to contract, which relationships to cultivate, and which to cut. Advice that Adrian had often taken because it was good advice, delivered by a man with experience and apparent loyalty and no visible reason to do anything except what he claimed to be doing. which was exactly what made it effective. "He's been steering us," Adrian said. "Not a question." The Eastern Lane pullback 3 years ago. The Luxembourg restructure. The decision to... He stopped. He ran the list forward in his head and it kept going, kept accumulating weight. Every major strategic decision for the last decade that I thought I made. Reeves said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. Adrian turned away from the screen. "Where are Marcus and Fitch right now?" "Webb is at the main building. Fitch went dark 2 hours ago. Phone off, car not moving." "Find Fitch," Adrian said, carefully. "Buckam." Elena received the port file copies at 11:15, not from Adrian's organization, but from her own people, who had spent the morning pulling what they could from peripheral sources. Shipping manifests, customs declarations, third-party logistics records that intersected with Voss port operations without being stored on Voss servers. She spread them across the large table in the estate's working room and stood over them with Petra and a young analyst named Dre, who had the rare quality of being able to hold multiple datasets in his head simultaneously and speak about them in plain language. 3 years of irregular routing, Dre said, pointing to clusters he'd already marked. Small enough to stay below automated flagging thresholds, but consistent. The same ghost account structure shows up here, here, and here. He tapped 3 separate manifest clusters. And the cargo designations they're legitimate goods. Refrigeration equipment, actually. But the weight discrepancies on the manifest suggest secondary cargo in approximately 30% of the containers. Elena looked at the clusters. What kind of secondary cargo? Dre hesitated. Based on the weight and the routing, the destinations, I think it's weapons, older military hardware, the kind that gets moved when someone is quietly arming multiple parties simultaneously. Elena straightened up. She looked at Petra. He's been running weapons through Adrian's ports, she said, without Adrian knowing, to 3 separate organizations. She picked up one of the manifests. And if it ever came to light, if anyone looked at the port records, it would appear to be a Voss operation. Which gives Lucien leverage, Petra said, over Adrian, over the port authorities, over the 3 organizations receiving the shipments. It's not leverage, Elena said. It's a trigger. She set the manifest down. He doesn't need to start the war himself. He just needs to release this information to the right people at the right moment. Every organization on the receiving end of these shipments thinks they've been dealing with Adrian. The moment they find out it's been a ghost operation running through Adrian's infrastructure, they'll assume betrayal, Petra said quietly. 3 separate organizations, all believing Adrian has been playing them, simultaneously. Elena looked at the map overlay Dre had pulled up. That's not a war, that's an execution with multiple triggers. Her phone buzzed. It was a number she didn't recognize, but the prefix was one she knew. It was an internal Ashcroft routing code, the kind used by family operatives in the field for urgent contact. She answered. The voice on the other end was male, young, slightly out of breath. Miss Ashcroft, I'm with the surveillance unit on the Lucien Voss townhouse. He left 40 minutes ago. We followed him to a private airfield on the northern perimeter. Elena's hand tightened on the phone. He's leaving the city? No, he met someone there. We got partial identification on the contact. Female, 50s, Eastern European travel documents. She gave him a case. He's back in the city now. A pause. But the case, we got an image of it when she opened it briefly for his inspection. Our technical team believes it contains a signal device, the kind used to trigger remote broadcasts. Elena stood very still. A broadcast, she said, as in distributing information simultaneously to multiple recipients. Yes, that's our assessment. She thanked him and hung up. She looked at Petra. He's going to release the port records, not to law enforcement, to the 3 organizations simultaneously. He's going to tell each of them that Adrian has been running weapons through their supply chains and skimming cargo. He's going to do it in a way that looks like a leak, like someone inside the Voss organization finally talked. She picked up her coat from the chair. How long before he uses it? If he just received the device, Petra calculated, he'll want to be positioned first, somewhere defensible, somewhere neither family can reach him quickly. She paused. He has a property. Mountain facility. Officially a private security training compound. We flagged it in the file. Elena was already moving. Get me Adrian. He picked up on the second ring. Lucian has a broadcast device, she said. He's going to release fabricated port records to all three organizations simultaneously. Each of them will believe you've been running weapons through their supply chains and taking cuts. You'll have three separate hostile organizations moving on you within hours of each other. A beat of silence. When? We don't know. Soon. He's positioning first. He'll go to the mountain compound. I know the compound, Adrian said, and his voice had gone to that quiet place again, the one that meant he was already moving past emotion into mechanics. I've been there twice. He always invited me personally, gave me the tour. Another beat. He was showing me his fortress. He wanted me to know what I'd be walking into if it ever came to that. Or he was letting you believe you understood it, Elena said. Don't assume the layout you saw is the layout that's there. A brief silence. Where are you? He said. The estate. I'm sending you something. Aerial survey of the compound from 18 months ago. It's the most recent I have. I have something better, she said. My grandfather had it surveilled 6 months ago. I'll send you ours. Elena. His voice shifted slightly, just slightly. The three organizations he's been arming through the ghost accounts. One of them is the Draven Group. She knew the name. Everyone in their world knew the name. The Draven Group was not large, but it was vicious in the specific way of organizations that had nothing to lose. And it had a particular history with the Ashcroft Syndicate, a territorial conflict 15 years ago that had ended badly for Draven and that they had been waiting with notable patience to revisit. He's been supplying them specifically to use against us, she said. Once they believe you sanctioned the weapon shipments through Ashcroft channels, that you were running them as a supply chain and cutting them short. They'll come for the estate, she said. Yes. She stood in the working room with the maps and the manifests and the cold morning light. She thought about the estate, the staff, the people who'd been with her family for decades, who had nothing to do with any of this except that they were here. How many people does Draven have operational right now, she asked. Reeves puts it at 60 to 80 in country. Probably more on short notice. Lucian's compound? Unknown. Could be 30, could be 100. He's had 18 months since my last visit. A silence. We need to move before he broadcasts, Elena said. Agreed. How fast can you mobilize? She looked at Petra. Petra held up 4 fingers and mouthed, hours. 4 hours, Elena said. I need 3, Adrian said. Meet me at the Kelvin site. He gave her the address and hung up. She arrived at the Kelvin site at 2:15 in the afternoon, and the first thing she noticed was Marcus Webb standing near the far wall with the expression of a man who had been told to stay put and was finding it difficult. She stopped inside the door. She looked at Adrian. Why is he here? She said. Because I needed to know what he knew, and keeping him here is safer than letting him run. Adrian crossed the room toward her. He looked worse than he had that morning, or more precisely, he looked more honest. The performance of composure was getting harder to maintain, and he'd stopped trying as hard. He's been talking. About what? About a meeting that happened 4 months ago that I didn't know about, between Lucien and Fitch. Adrian stopped in front of her. And about what Lucien offered them. She looked past him at Marcus. Marcus met her eyes and looked away. Tell her, Adrian said without turning around. Marcus pushed off the wall. He looked like a man doing something that cost him. Lucien came to Fitch 8 months ago, said the organization was going to face a consolidation event, that someone was going to move on Adrian, and that the inner circle had a choice to make about whether they wanted to be inside the new structure or outside it. He paused. He said the Ashcroft heiress was the threat, that she'd been placed in Adrian's household deliberately to gather intelligence, and that the divorce was the opening move in a hostile acquisition. Elena looked at him for a long moment. And you believed that? Marcus stopped. He had the grace, at least, to look like the word embarrassed him. Fitch believed it. I had doubts. But Fitch had seniority, and Lucien had documentation, financial records showing Ashcroft money flowing into accounts adjacent to our operations. Fabricated, Elena said. I know that now. You took $4.2 million, she said. The room went very quiet. Marcus's face changed. That's wire transfer, Geneva account, registered to a holding company with Lucien's legal firm in the chain. She kept her voice flat. I have the routing records. My grandfather flagged the transfer 3 months ago and traced it forward. The money moved from Lucien's structure to an intermediary to you. She paused. You were paid to push Adrian toward the divorce. Marcus looked at Adrian. Adrian was looking at the floor. Adrian, Marcus started. I know, Adrian said. He still wasn't looking up. Coyle found the parallel notation this morning, yours and Fitch's, same originating instruction. The silence that followed was the kind that didn't recover easily. Where's Fitch? Elena said. Reeves spoke from across the room. We found him. He's at a hotel in the Northern District. Checked in this morning under a name we almost missed. He paused. He has company, 2 men we don't recognize. Eastern European travel documents. Elena and Adrian looked at each other. Draven, she said. Fitch is already talking to them, Adrian said. Lucien doesn't even need the broadcast device. Fitch is doing the groundwork in person. The room recalibrated. Elena could feel it, the way a situation tightens when the variables compound faster than the planning can absorb them. She'd felt it before, in smaller contexts, and she'd learned to let the recalibration happen without fighting it, to find the new geometry quickly and move from there. We can't wait 4 hours, she said. No, Adrian agreed. And we can't hit this compound without knowing the current layout. No. Which means we need someone inside before we move. She looked at the maps on the wall. The aerial survey from 6 months ago was already pinned there. Her people had transmitted it while she was in transit. She walked to it. She studied it. The compound sat in a mountain fold, accessed by a single paved road and 2 service tracks, with what appeared to be a main structure, 2 auxiliary buildings, and an underground level that the aerial survey couldn't fully resolve. What's here? She said, pointing to the underground level's outline. Reeves came to stand beside her. Best guess from the survey. Storage and communications. Possibly a secure room. The power draw on the property is 3 times what the visible structures would require. Generator capacity for a broadcast array, Elena said. And for keeping people comfortable for an extended period, Reeves added. If he's planning to sit this out while the 3 organizations move, he needs to be comfortable, self-sufficient. Elena looked at the service tracks. One came from the northwest, the other from the east. These aren't on the official property survey, she said. No. Which means they were built after purchase, for access that he didn't want on record. She traced the eastern track with her finger. It curved behind the second auxiliary building and appeared to terminate near the underground level's position. This is how supplies come in, and this is how he expects to leave if he needs to. She turned around. Adrian was watching her. You've done this before, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It had a different quality, something closer to the belated recognition of something he'd been standing next to for a long time without seeing. My grandfather didn't build what we have by being the loudest person in the room, she said. He taught me early, read the map, find the track that isn't on the map. That's where the truth lives. A brief silence. I have 2 people who can go in ahead, she said. Small team, light. They won't trigger his perimeter sensors if they come up the eastern track on foot. They can give us a current layout and confirm whether the broadcast device is already installed. Timeline. 4 hours to get there. 2 hours on the ground. We'd have current intelligence by... She checked. 9 tonight. We move at 10. Adrian turned to Reeves. What's our mobilization capacity at 10 tonight? 40 effective. 60 if I pull from the secondary roster. Pull from the secondary roster. Reeves nodded and moved away to make calls. Adrian looked back at Elena. And if Lucien broadcasts before 9? She held his gaze. Then we deal with what comes, and we still take the compound. The broadcast changes the urgency. It doesn't change the target. He nodded slowly. Marcus spoke from the far wall, very quietly. I can help. I know Lucien's communication patterns, the specific people he contacts. I can monitor for pre-broadcast signals. Neither Adrian nor Elena looked at him for a long moment. You're going to sit in that chair, Adrian said finally, pointing to a chair bolted to the wall near the technical setup. And you're going to monitor every channel Reeves gives you access to, and you're going to tell me the second anything moves. And when this is over, Marcus, when this is over, you and I are going to have a conversation that has nothing to do with any of this, and it's going to be the last conversation we have. He paused. Sit down. Marcus sat down. What? The two-person advance team went in at 5 in the evening. Elena tracked them on a tablet while she and Adrian worked through logistics at the long table, moving between the aerial survey and the manifest records and the financial documentation with the focused, grinding efficiency of two people who have set aside everything personal in service of a practical problem. They didn't talk about the marriage. They didn't talk about the 7 years. There was no version of that conversation that fit inside the next 16 hours, and they both knew it, and they moved around it the way experienced people move around an obstacle they've acknowledged and chosen to address later. At 7:42, the advance team checked in. The signal came through Petra, who relayed it to Elena in 3 sentences. Elena set down the manifest she was reading. Adrian, she said. He looked up. The compound has more people than the survey suggested. My team counted 83 on the visible perimeter alone. She paused. And Lucien isn't alone in there. My team identified 2 hostages being held in the underground level. She looked at him. One of them is your comptroller, the man who flagged the Luxembourg exposure 2 days ago. Adrian's face didn't change visibly, but something in the room changed. And the other? He said. Elena looked at the tablet. My grandfather's personal secretary, she said. An elderly man named Hartwell, who has been with the family for 30 years. She set the tablet down. Lucien has people from both families. He's been collecting leverage. Adrian stood up from the table. He's not planning to broadcast and run, he said. He's planning to use the hostages to negotiate. After the broadcast triggers the 3 organizations, he'll reach out to both families and offer a ceasefire, on the condition that we each cede him operational control of specific assets. The hostages are the guarantee that we don't refuse. And if we refuse anyway, Elena said, the hostages die, the records are released, and we spend the next year fighting on 3 fronts. He looked at her. He's not gambling. He's already won. He just hasn't announced it yet. She looked at the map, at the eastern service track, at the underground level where 2 old men were being held in the dark by a patient and meticulous man who had spent a decade building toward exactly this moment. She thought about her grandfather's handwriting in the file margins. He reached out. Offer declined. Watch him. Her grandfather had known, had watched, had left a breadcrumb trail she only found because someone sent her a photograph. Had her grandfather known it might come to this? Had he prepared for it? She opened the bag at her feet and reached past the file folders to the bottom where she'd placed, that morning, a sealed envelope she'd found in the estate's library. The room her grandfather used, the room no one entered without permission, the room where she'd gone at 4 in the morning because she couldn't sleep and because grief, in her family, expressed itself as productivity. The envelope had been in the center drawer of his desk, unsealed, with her name on the outside. She hadn't opened it yet. She opened it now. Inside was a single handwritten page and a small key and a set of coordinates. She read the page. She read it again. She looked up at Adrian. My grandfather left me something, she said, before he died. He left me something he believed I would need. She looked at the coordinates. At the compound. Adrian stared at her. At Lucien's compound. At a location 40 meters east of the compound's perimeter fence. She showed him the coordinates on the map overlay. My grandfather had something planted there. The letter doesn't say what. It says, she read the relevant line aloud. When Lucien finally moves, and he will move, you will need what I've left you more than anything I could say. Trust the position. Trust the ground. The room was silent except for the hum of equipment and Marcus quietly working the communication monitors across the space. Adrian looked at the map. He looked at Elena. His expression had the particular quality of a man who has run out of the kind of certainty that kept him functional for 14 years and is discovering, in its absence, something he doesn't have a name for yet. "Your grandfather was preparing for this," he said. "He knew Lucien would eventually—" "He knew," she said. "He just didn't know when. And he knew I might not know what I was walking into." She folded the letter carefully. "He left me something at the location, 40 meters east. Whatever it is, it's been there long enough that Lucien's people haven't found it. Or Lucien knows it's there and is waiting for you to go get it," Adrian said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "That's also possible." He held her gaze. "Then we go in knowing that," he said. "We go in with our eyes open, and we take what your grandfather left and we use it. And if Lucien is counting on us walking into something—" He stopped. He looked at the map one more time. He looked at the underground level where two old men were sitting in the dark. "Then we make sure we're not the ones who blink." Outside, the afternoon had died into early evening, and the mountain where Lucien Voss sat with his broadcast device and his hostages and his decade of patient scheming was invisible in the distance. But it was there, and the clock between now and the moment he decided to use what he had built was running in a direction that didn't favor waiting. Elena put the letter and the key in her coat pocket. She looked at Adrian Voss, this man she had loved badly and been failed by completely, and she thought that there was a version of the next 12 hours in which neither of them walked back down that mountain, and that the version in which they did required them to be something neither had ever managed to be in 7 years of marriage, honest with each other, and fast. "Let's go," she said. They left the Kelvin site at 8:15 in 3 vehicles. No convoy, no formation, just 3 ordinary cars running 30 seconds apart on different route segments, the way people move when they can't afford to look like they're moving together. Elena rode in the second car with Petra and Dre. Adrian rode in the third with Reeves. The first car held 4 of Reeves's secondary roster men who'd been briefed in under 20 minutes and had the particular quality of people who asked operational questions rather than contextual ones. How many? What approach? What signal? Because context was a luxury, and they'd learned to work without it. The mountain was 2 hours out. Elena spent the first hour with the aerial survey on her tablet, and the letter in her coat pocket, and the small key turning between her fingers without her quite deciding to do it. She looked at the coordinates again. 40 meters east of the perimeter fence. Her grandfather had been deliberate about everything, the distance, the direction, the fact that he'd written it down at all. He'd been a man who preferred things unwritten, undocumented, existing only in the minds of people he trusted completely. He'd written this down, which meant he'd known there was a possibility she'd have to find it alone, without guidance, without him. She put the key in her pocket next to the letter and looked out the window at the dark moving past. The road to the compound's eastern approach wasn't on any navigation system. Adrian had the coordinates from a source he didn't name, and Reeves drove from memory for the last 40 minutes, headlights off on the final stretch, moving by the ambient light of a partial moon that gave the mountain landscape a gray, flat quality that made distance difficult to judge. They stopped 800 meters from the perimeter. The advance team met them at the tree line. The team leader was a compact woman named Solis, who'd been with Elena's family for 6 years, and who delivered her briefing in the same tone she might use to describe a building's floor plan. 87 personnel confirmed, perimeter and interior, Solis said. Main building has 4 floors above ground and 2 below. Broadcast array is on the roof of the main structure. It's been installed since our last survey, probably in the last 30 days. Underground level 2 is where the hostages are. Access is through a stairwell off the main corridor. Ground floor, east side. She pulled out a hand-drawn layout and held it up. The eastern service track runs to a loading dock on the rear of the building, here. The dock has 1 guard, 1 camera, fixed angle. The camera covers the dock, but not the track itself. "And the 40-meter location?" Elena said. Solis looked at her. "We found it. We didn't open it. It's buried, waterproof case, marker stake that looks like a survey flag. You'd miss it if you weren't looking." A pause. "There's also something else. 30 meters from the marker, there's a secondary surveillance point. Not Lucien's. It's older, different equipment signature. Your family's." Elena absorbed that. Her grandfather had put surveillance on his own planted cache. He'd been watching to see if anyone found it. Is the surveillance still active? She said. Transmitting to an Ashcroft relay node, Solis confirmed. Elena looked at Adrian. He was looking at the layout, but she could tell from the set of his shoulders that he was listening to everything. He knew if anyone disturbed the cache, Elena said quietly, because he was watching it. And if no one ever came for it, the cache stayed intact. What's in it? Adrian said. We're about to find out. She went with Solis and one other, moving low along the eastern track with the mountains cold working through her coat and the ground uneven under her feet in the dark. 40 meters east of the fence, the track curved slightly and the tree line thinned. Solis pointed. Elena crouched and found the survey stake with her hand before she saw it. A thin metal rod flush with the ground, easy to miss, the kind of thing a perimeter sweep might walk past a dozen times. She used the key. The case below it was military-grade waterproof, sealed with a combination that the key released mechanically. Inside, wrapped in protective material, was a hard drive and a folded document and a small device Elena recognized as a narrowband transmitter of the type her grandfather's organization used for secure broadcasts. She unfolded the document in the dark, using a hooded light. It was an archive index. A list of files contained on the hard drive. She ran the light down the list slowly. Audio recordings, video recordings, financial records, dated entries going back 23 years. The first dated entry was from the year Adrian's father Harlan Voss died. Her hands were very still. She folded the document. She put the hard drive in her interior jacket pocket. She put the transmitter in her left coat pocket next to the key. She sealed the case and replaced the stake exactly as she'd found it, because her grandfather had taught her that you never leave evidence of your own presence if you can help it. She moved back to the tree line. Adrian was waiting. He looked at her face. What is it? He said. Everything, she said. He kept everything. 23 years of recordings and documentation. She looked at him steadily. Including the night your father died. The silence that followed was the kind that comes after something lands that can't be unlanded. He had audio from that night? Adrian's voice was careful, the way voices get when the body is managing something large. According to the index. She held his gaze. We can verify once we're through this, but if the index is accurate, we use it tonight, Adrian said. His voice had changed, not louder, denser. If Lucien is in there with his broadcast device and his hostages, we counter-broadcast. We release the archive before he releases his fabrications. It's not that simple, Elena said. We don't know what's in those recordings beyond the index entries. If we broadcast blindly, then we preview first. He looked at Reeves. Can the transmitter interface with our system? Reeves examined the device. Give me 8 minutes. You have 5. Well, 4 minutes and 40 seconds later, Reeves had the transmitter connected to their mobile setup and the hard drive's authentication verified. He pulled the first 3 files from the night of Harlan Voss's death and ran them on a secured screen, audio through a single earpiece that he handed to Adrian. Adrian listened for 90 seconds. He handed the earpiece back. He stood at the edge of the tree line looking at the compound's lights in the middle distance, and he was quiet for a long time, and no one spoke to him. When he turned back, his face had the particular quality of something that has been decided rather than felt, the emotion not absent but placed somewhere internal, behind the practical necessity of the next 4 hours. It's Lucien's voice, he said, giving instructions. To the man who was later identified as the hired shooter. He paused. And a payment confirmation. Time-stamped 40 minutes before my father was killed. Petra made a quiet sound. Solis looked at the ground. Elena said nothing. She waited. We go in, Adrian said. We get the hostages out first. Then we counter-broadcast. Then we take Lucien. He looked at Elena. In that order. Agreed, she said. But I need you to understand something. If the broadcast from the archive goes out before we have the hostages secure, Lucien will know immediately. He'll use them. Then we have to be fast enough. We have to be perfect. A beat. I'm not perfect, he said. No, she agreed. Neither am I. We go anyway. They breached the eastern dock at 10:47. The single guard went down quietly, quickly, the way Solis's people worked. No shots, no noise, just the abrupt silence of a man who didn't see the approach in time. The camera blind spot was exactly where the aerial survey said it would be. They moved through the loading dock in single file, 8 people total, and the interior of the compound had the institutional cold of a space that had been built for function rather than comfort. Concrete walls, fluorescent strips, the smell of generator fuel and recycled air. Adrian moved on Reeves's left. Elena moved behind them with Petra at her shoulder. The main corridor was wider than Elena had expected. The layout Solis had drawn was accurate for the visible structure, but the interior spacing felt different. Ceilings higher, the central corridor running longer than the exterior suggested. Lucien had modified the internal geometry. She filed that and kept moving. The stairwell to the underground level was where Solis said it would be. East side, ground floor, a steel door with a keypad. Reeves put a bypass device on the keypad. 11 seconds. The door opened. They went down. Tishan, level 1. Underground was storage. Metal shelving, equipment cases, the kind of organized accumulation that spoke of careful, long-term preparation. Level 2 was where the air changed. Warmer, filtered, the quality of a space where people were being kept rather than where things were being stored. A single guard at the base of the stairs. Solis moved first. He was down before he registered the sound of her footstep. 2 doors on the left side of the corridor. Elena tested the first, locked. Reeves bypassed it in 7 seconds. Inside, Adrian's comptroller, a middle-aged man named Halberg who blinked in the sudden light like a man who'd lost track of whether it was day or night. His wrists had marks from restraints. He was otherwise uninjured. "Can you walk?" Elena asked. "Yes." His voice was rough. "Yes, I can walk." The second door, 6 seconds. Inside, Hartwell, her grandfather's secretary, sitting upright in a metal chair with his hands folded in his lap, as if he'd decided early on that dignity was the one thing no one could take from him. He was 71 years old, and he looked at Elena when the light hit him, and his face did something complicated, and she looked away before it finished. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, "can you walk, Hartwell?" "I can do considerably more than walk," he said, and stood up, and she believed him. She directed Solis to get both men back up the stairs and out through the loading dock. Solis took 2 people with her. That left Elena, Adrian, Reeves, Petra, and one other. A man named Cass who'd said 6 words in the entire operation and moved like someone who'd done this in worse conditions. "Hostages are moving," Elena said to Adrian. He nodded. His jaw was tight and his breathing was controlled. The deliberate kind, the kind you do when your heart rate is too high and you're managing it manually. "Broadcast," he said. "We need to get to the roof." "I know where the roof access is," he said. "I walked it twice, 2 years ago when Lucien gave me the tour. He may have changed it. He may have. We go and find out." The stairwell to the upper floors was at the far end of the main corridor, which meant crossing 60 feet of open space between the corridor junction and the stairwell door. The building had gone quiet, not empty, but that particular quiet of a large number of people distributed through a structure rather than concentrated in one place. The quiet that could break into noise in any direction at any moment. They moved in a tight line. They were 40 feet from the stairwell when a door opened on their left, and a man came through it fast, not expecting them, the collision mutual and immediate. He went for his radio and Cass put him on the floor before the radio cleared the holster, but the sound of the impact was too loud in the corridor's concrete silence, and somewhere above them a voice called down, sharp and questioning. No one answered it. The voice called again. Footsteps on a floor above. "Move," Adrian said. They moved. Not running. Running was noise. But the fastest controlled advance Elena had managed in a confined space, and the footsteps above were getting louder and she could hear other sounds now, multiple sources. The compound waking up to the fact that something was wrong in the way buildings do, incrementally, and then all at once. They hit the stairwell door. Reeves pushed through. They went up. Second floor. Voices, movement. A man at the far end of a corridor who saw them and shouted before Cass put him down from 30 feet. The shot loud as a thunderclap in the enclosed space. All pretense of silence gone. "We're running," Elena said to no one in particular. They ran. Third floor, fourth. Roof access was a steel hatch at the top of a final half flight, and Adrian hit the release bar on it hard, and the hatch blew open into cold mountain air and the sound of wind, and somewhere behind and below them, the compound's alarm system finally found its voice, an electronic pulse that echoed off the mountain face and would be audible a mile in any direction. The roof. The broadcast array was exactly where the survey said it was. A cluster of antenna hardware and equipment cases bolted to a concrete mounting block on the north side of the roof, already active, its indicator lights steady in the dark. Lucien had installed it, calibrated it, and left it ready to use. Reeves went to it immediately. He pulled out the transmitter and the hard drive connection. His hands were moving fast, and Elena stood at his shoulder watching, while Petra and Adrian and Cass positioned at the roof access hatch against what was coming. "How long?" Elena said. 3 minutes to authenticate and cue the broadcast. Maybe less." "We don't have 3 minutes." "Then I have 2.5. The hatch banged. Cass braced against it. Something hit it from below. Hard, more than one person. Adrian looked at Elena across the roof. "If this works," he started. "It has to work," she said. "Don't say if." He almost said something else. Instead, he turned back to the hatch and added his weight to Cass's, and the hatch groaned under the combined pressure of however many people Lucien had on the floors below. 90 seconds, Reeves said. The hatch buckled. A gap opened on one side and a hand came through and Cass dealt with it, and the gap closed but didn't seal. 60, Reeves said. Elena looked at the array. She looked at the hard drive connected to the transmitter connected to the array. 23 years of her grandfather's careful, patient documentation. Every crime Lucien had committed, recorded, and indexed by an old man who'd understood, long before anyone else did, what Lucien Voss was and what he was building toward. Her grandfather had spent 23 years preparing for a night he'd never lived to see. 30, Reeves said. The hatch blew. Not opened. Blew, the bar shearing under coordinated force, and 4 men came through fast and the roof became a different kind of space, close and violent and loud, and Petra took the first hit and went down on one knee but didn't stop. And Adrian was moving before Elena could process it, fast and direct in the way of a man who's fought in enclosed spaces before and knows that the first 3 seconds determine the next 30. She heard Reeves say, 10, and then the equipment made a sound she didn't know, and she spun toward it. The array lit up. Every indicator on the broadcast equipment went from ready orange to transmit green simultaneously, and the signal went out on every frequency the array covered, targeted, distributed, reaching the secure channels of every organization that mattered in a radius that covered 3 countries. 23 years of Lucien Voss. Every word, every recording, every payment, every murder, released. And from somewhere below them, from somewhere deep in the building, a sound rose that was not an alarm and not a gunshot, but something closer to the sound a large organizational structure makes when its foundation is suddenly and catastrophically removed. Voices, first confused, then urgent, then the particular texture of men who've just received information that changes everything they thought they were doing and who are now deciding, very rapidly, where their loyalty actually lives. Lucien's own people, receiving the archive. Reading their commander's voice committing crimes they hadn't been paid enough to absorb. The fighting on the roof went from 4-on-4 to the particular confusion of men whose phones were suddenly receiving material that made them uncertain what they were fighting for. And that uncertainty was a different kind of weapon. And Elena had counted on it. Her grandfather had counted on it, because the Ashcroft way had never been the loudest approach. It had always been the truest one. She turned and found Reeves bleeding from a cut above his eye, still at the equipment, verifying the broadcast had fully transmitted. She turned again and found Petra on her feet, jaw set, a hand pressed to her side. She turned and found Adrian. He was at the far edge of the roof near the parapet, and he wasn't fighting anymore. The men who'd come through the hatch were either down or standing still with the specific stillness of people who've just received a reason to reconsider. And he was looking toward the stairwell, where a figure had appeared in the hatch opening that wasn't one of Lucien's guards. The figure was Lucien. 61 years old, silver-haired, wearing a jacket over a dark shirt, no tie, the particular neatness of a man who'd expected to spend this evening watching events unfold from a distance and had not expected to be on a roof in the cold with his archive broadcasting to everyone who mattered in his world. He looked at Adrian first, then at Elena. His face was composed. That was the thing that struck her. Not rage, not panic, but the careful composure of a man making rapid calculations about what remained salvageable. "You're faster than I gave you credit for," he said. His voice was conversational, as if they'd run into each other at that private club. "Both of you." No one spoke. "The archive," he said. "Your grandfather's work, I assume." He looked at Elena. "He was a thorough man. I always respected that." A pause. "But you understand that documentation without corroborating witnesses has limitations. My lawyers—" "Lucien," Adrian said. Lucien looked at him. "I have Coyle," Adrian said. "I have Marcus. I have Fitch, who is currently in a hotel room explaining himself to people who are recording everything he says." A pause. "I have the routing records. I have the financial chain from Geneva to your legal firm to the account that paid for my father's death." He took one step forward. "And I have you on audio giving the instruction, in your own voice, released 10 minutes ago to every organization that matters." Lucien absorbed this. His composure didn't break, but something in it thinned. The way ice thins, not visibly, but in a way you can feel if you've walked on enough of it. "You came for the hostages," Lucien said, "and the broadcast. Very efficient, but you're forgetting something." He reached into his jacket pocket, unhurried, and produced a phone, and he held it up so they could see the screen. "The Draven Group received my version of the port records 40 minutes ago. Not from the array. I sent it the moment your breach alarm tripped the sensor on the eastern track. They've been moving since then." He looked at Elena. "Toward your estate." Elena went cold. 62 people, Lucien continued. "I'm told they have a particular interest in settling something with your family. I had nothing to do with that. I simply gave them information they found very motivating." He turned the phone slightly. "The estate has, 40 staff? Your security is good, but Draven has numbers and they have history with your family and they have an hour's head start." He lowered the phone. "So here's what I'm proposing," he said in the same conversational tone. "I make one call. I stop Draven. In exchange—" "No," Elena said. Lucien looked at her. "No," she said again. "I'm not negotiating with you." She pulled out her own phone. She dialed Petra, who was 3 feet away, and answered immediately. "Get the estate on the line, now. Tell them Draven is 30 to 40 minutes out. Full security posture. I want everyone who isn't trained moved to the basement level, and I want the north gate sealed." She lowered the phone. She looked at Lucien. "My grandfather didn't build what we have by relying on one line of defense." 62 people, Elena. I heard you the first time." Lucien looked at Adrian. Adrian looked back at him. 20 years of dinners, of advice, of the patient, layered performance of a loyal uncle. Of a man who had murdered his brother and spent 2 decades standing close enough to his brother's son to watch the wound he'd created without ever letting it heal completely. "You killed my father," Adrian said. Not a question, not an accusation. A statement of established fact, the way you say the name of a city you've arrived in. Declarative, final, done. Lucien's composure held for another 3 seconds. Then it shifted. Not breaking, but changing quality, from performance into something older and colder and more honest. "Harlan was going to give it all away," Lucien said. "Everything we'd built. He had a meeting scheduled with federal mediators. He was going to negotiate a transition, hand over assets, secure immunity for himself, and—" His jaw tightened. "He wasn't going to survive what came after. I gave him a faster death than the alternative." "You gave him a death that served you," Adrian said. "Everything I've done has served this organization, has kept it intact, has kept it moving forward when Harlan would have—" "This organization," Adrian said quietly, "is finished. Everything you've built inside it. Every manipulation, every steered decision, every asset you positioned. It's done. Tonight." Lucien looked at him for a long moment, and then he moved. Not toward Adrian, but sideways, toward the parapet, and he had something in his hand that wasn't the phone, something small and dark. And he raised it, and he wasn't aiming at Adrian. He was aiming at Elena. The shot was close enough that Elena heard the air move. She didn't move in time, but Adrian did. He crossed the distance between them in the moment before the trigger pulled, and he was between her and the gun when it fired, and the impact turned him sideways, and he went down on one knee at the parapet edge, with one hand catching the concrete lip and his other hand pressed to his left side. Elena was already moving. She went low, and she went fast, and she hit Lucien at the knees before he could recalibrate, both of them going down hard on the concrete roof surface, and the weapon skittered away across the rooftop, and Lucien was stronger than she'd expected. 61 years old and still carrying the density of a man who'd spent his life in a world that required physical credibility, but she had leverage, and she had the particular fury of someone who has been underestimated for a very long time by a very particular kind of man. She had his arm locked and his face against the concrete, and he wasn't moving. Cass and Petra reached them in the next 4 seconds. Elena stood up. She turned to Adrian. He was still on one knee at the parapet, and he was still upright, which meant the shot had hit something that wasn't immediately catastrophic, but his breathing was audible and wrong, and his hand was dark against his side in the roof's ambient light. She crossed to him. She crouched in front of him and looked at the wound without touching it. The angle, the placement, the rate of bleeding visible around his fingers. "How bad?" he said. "You need a surgeon in under an hour," she said. "That's not what I asked." "It's what I'm telling you." She looked at his face. He was pale, and his jaw was set, and his eyes were focused with the fierce deliberateness of a man using will to compensate for what his body was losing. "We need to get you down." "Lucien, Cass has him. He's not going anywhere." She looked at Reeves. "Vehicles, now!" Reeves was already on the radio. Adrian looked at her from his position on one knee at the parapet edge with the mountain dark and cold behind him, and the compound's noise reduced now to something more confused than hostile. Lucy Eaton's people absorbing the archive, making decisions, the organized machinery of his compound beginning to come apart in the specific way of structures whose center has been removed. "The estate," he said. "My people have it," she said. "Draven won't find what they're expecting." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She wasn't entirely sure. She was 60% sure, and she was keeping the other 40% locked in a part of herself she'd deal with later. "Right now I need you to let me help you stand up." He looked at her. For a moment, just a moment, the practicality between them dropped away, and what was underneath it was visible, and it was not comfortable to look at. Two people who had lived in the same space for 7 years and barely seen each other, standing on a mountain rooftop in the aftermath of the worst night of both their lives. One of them bleeding through his hand and the other holding herself together by the specific discipline of someone who learned young that falling apart was a luxury reserved for later. "Okay," he said. She put her arm around him. He let her. They moved toward the hatch, and below them the compound continued its slow collapse into the truth it had been built to hide. And somewhere at the bottom of the mountain 3 vehicles were turning their headlights on, and somewhere across the dark the estate was holding. And somewhere in the cold concrete of the rooftop behind them, Lucien Voss was being secured by people who had just heard his voice commit crimes across 23 years and who no longer had any difficulty deciding which side they were on. And Elena Ashcroft moved Adrian Voss toward the hatch opening with her arm bearing more of his weight than she let him know. And she did not think about 7 years, and she did not think about the divorce papers on the kitchen table. And she did not think about any of the things that would require thinking about later. She thought only about the next step, and the one after it, and getting them both to the bottom of the mountain before the hour ran out. They got him down the mountain in 41 minutes. The vehicle ride was the worst part. The road was rough, and every jolt moved through Adrian's body and out of his mouth as a sound he tried to control, and mostly couldn't. Elena kept pressure on the wound with both hands, and her knees braced against the seat in front of her, and she talked to him the whole way, not comforting things, just information, where they were, how far, what was going to happen when they arrived. Because she'd learned young that people held on better to facts than to reassurance. There was a surgeon waiting at a private facility Elena's family maintained 30 minutes from the mountain. He'd been called the moment they came off the roof. He met the car at the door with 2 others, and they took Adrian from her hands and moved him inside on a gurney and Elena stood in the entrance with his blood on her palms and up to her forearms, and she watched the doors close between them. Petra came and stood beside her. "The estate," Elena said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "Held," Petra said. "Draven hit the north perimeter at 11:50. Our people were positioned. They lost 7 men in the first 10 minutes and pulled back. By then the archive broadcast had reached Draven's own command structure." She paused. Half of Draven's leadership learned in the middle of the assault that Lucian had fabricated the intelligence that sent them there. They stopped fighting. The ones who didn't stop, she looked at her hands. They were dealt with. We lost 2. Hartwell insisted on being useful and got in the way and is fine and very pleased with himself. Elena closed her eyes for a moment. 2 people who'd worked for her family, who'd had names and histories, and people who would need to be told. "I want their families taken care of," she said. "Personally, not through an intermediary. Already arranged." Elena nodded. She looked at her hands. "Lucian?" "Secured. At the mountain, then transferred. He's in a room at the facility, 3 doors down from where they're operating on Adrian." Petra's voice was flat. "He hasn't said anything since the roof." Elena looked toward the doors the surgeon had disappeared through. "I'll deal with Lucien," she said. "After." The surgery took 4 hours. Elena spent them washing the blood off her arms in a small tiled room and then sitting in a hard chair in a hallway that smelled of antiseptic. And she did not sleep, and she did not cry, and she did not do any of the things a person might reasonably do after the night she'd had. She sat with her hands folded in her lap in exactly the posture she'd seen Hartwell hold in that underground cell, and she understood, sitting there, why he'd chosen it. When everything else has been taken from you, dignity is the one thing you can decide to keep. At 4 a.m, the surgeon came out. He was tired and his scrubs were marked, and he sat down in the chair beside her without being invited, which she took as its own kind of report. "The bullet fractured a rib and lodged near the lower lobe of the left lung," he said. "There was significant bleeding. We controlled it. The lung was compromised but not destroyed." He rubbed his eyes. "He's going to live. He came close enough that I want to be honest with you about how close, but he's going to live. He'll need weeks, months for full function." Elena let out a breath she hadn't been aware of holding. "Can I see him?" "He's not conscious yet. Give it a few hours." The surgeon stood. He looked at her for a moment. "The man who was shot. He put himself in front of the bullet deliberately?" "Yes," she said. The surgeon nodded slowly, as if that answered a question he hadn't asked out loud, and he walked away down the antiseptic hall. She went to see Lucien first. He was in a plain room with a single bed and a chair and a window with a security screen over it, and he was sitting up, and his hands were secured, and when she came in he looked at her with the same composed expression he'd worn on the roof, though it had thinned further overnight into something closer to what was actually underneath. She didn't sit. "You want to know why?" he said. "That's why people come. They want the why." "No," Elena said. "I know why. You wanted what your brother had, and you spent 20 years telling yourself a story where taking it made you the responsible one." She looked at him. "I came to tell you what happens now." Lucian's composure held, but his eyes moved. "The archive is public within our world," she said. "Every organization that matters has heard your voice ordering your brother's death. The 3 groups you are arming have received the corroborating financial records. Draven learned mid-assault that you manufactured their motivation. There is not a single structure in 3 countries that will shelter you." She paused. "Your legal firm has already terminated its relationship with your holdings. Your accounts are being frozen by people who no longer see any advantage in protecting them. The men in your compound have scattered." "So you'll kill me," Lucian said. There was almost relief in it. "No," Elena said. He looked at her. "My grandfather spent 23 years documenting you instead of killing you," she said. "I used to wonder why. I understand it now. Killing you would have made you a story your people could tell themselves. The loyal uncle, martyred by the family that feared him. He didn't want you to have that." She stepped closer to the bed. "You're going to be handed to the authorities in 3 separate jurisdictions with a complete evidentiary record." You're going to spend whatever remains of your life as exactly what you are, a man who murdered his brother for a chair. No mystery, no legend, just the small documented facts of a small documented man. Lucien's jaw worked. That's worse than killing you, Elena said. My grandfather knew that too. She turned to go. He loved her, you know, Lucien said behind her. She stopped. Adrian, he never said it, couldn't, but I watched him for 7 years, and I watched the way he stopped noticing you, and it wasn't because you weren't there. Lucien's voice had gone quiet and strange. It was because noticing you would have meant admitting he'd married something he couldn't control, and control was the only love his father ever taught him. Harlan raised him to see affection as leverage. I made sure of it. It was the most useful thing I ever did. I raised the boy to be incapable of the one thing that could have saved him from me. Elena stood with her back to him for a long moment. You're telling me this, she said, because you want to take one more thing. You want me to walk out of here believing the damage was so deep it can't be undone. You want to poison the one thing you couldn't reach. She turned around. She looked at him. It won't work. Whatever your brother built into Adrian, and whatever you built on top of it, Adrian stepped in front of a bullet for me on that roof. You spent 20 years teaching him love was leverage. He just proved you failed. She left the room. She did not look back, and she did not let him see that her hands were shaking, because he had not earned the sight of it. Adrian woke a little after 7 in the morning. Elena was in the chair beside his bed when his eyes opened, and it took him a moment to find her, and when he did, his face did something she'd never seen it do in 7 years. It softened without calculation, without the split-second delay of a man deciding what expression served him. You're alive, he said. His voice was a wreck. So are you, she said. Barely. You have a fractured rib and a compromised lung, and you're going to be useless for months. The estate. Held. 2 of my people died. Draven collapsed when the archive reached them. She watched his face absorb the count, the 2, and she saw it land on him the way it had landed on her, not as an abstraction, but as a weight. Lucien is secured. He'll be handed to the authorities. He's finished. Adrian was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ceiling. My father, he said, the recording is real. The payment confirmation is real. He'll be charged for it, among everything else. She paused. You'll be able to close that, finally. Adrian's eyes were wet, and he didn't hide it, and he didn't perform it either. It was just there, the grief of a man who'd carried an unexplained wound for over a decade and had finally been given the name of the person who'd caused it. He killed him for a chair, Adrian said. Yes, and he spent 10 years sitting across from me, asking about my day. Yes, Adrian closed his eyes. How do you... He stopped. His breathing caught on the rib and he waited it out. How do you come back from being that wrong? About everything, for that long? Elena looked at him. You don't come back, she said. You go forward carrying it. That's the only direction that exists. She paused. My grandfather taught me that. He was wrong about people too sometimes. Trusted the wrong ones. Lost people because of it. He never pretended it hadn't happened. He just kept going, more carefully, and he documented everything so the same people couldn't do the same damage twice. She looked at her hands. That's what the archive was. It wasn't revenge. It was a man refusing to let his mistakes stay buried where they could keep hurting people. Adrian opened his eyes. Why did you warn me, he said, that first night, on the phone? You'd just signed divorce papers. I'd treated you like nothing for 7 years, and your first move was to call and warn me. He looked at her. Why? Elena was quiet for a long time. Because I loved you, she said. Past tense. And love doesn't stop being real just because it stops being returned. I spent 7 years protecting you from things you never knew about, and I didn't do it hoping you'd notice. I did it because that's what the thing was. It didn't need you to see it to be true. She met his eyes. The night you handed me those papers, I stopped being your wife. I didn't stop being someone who'd spent 7 years keeping you alive. Those aren't the same thing, and only one of them needs your permission. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. I didn't deserve any of it, he said. No, she agreed. You didn't. And there was no cruelty in it, and no softness either. Just the flat, clean truth of it, laid down between them like a fact they could both finally look at. Sus. The dismantling took months. Adrian did it from a hospital bed for the first 6 weeks, and then from a chair, and then slowly, on his own feet. He did not rebuild his organization. He took it apart. He'd spent 14 years building an empire on the architecture his father and Lucien had laid, and once he understood that the foundation itself had been poured by the man who'd murdered his father, he found he had no appetite for standing on it any longer. He handed the legitimate operations, the shipping, the security contracts, the actual businesses that had always existed underneath the other thing, to the people who ran them day to day, structured as something that could survive without him and without the blood-soaked traditions that had defined it. The rest, the parts that couldn't be made clean, he dissolved. Some of it went to the authorities as part of the same evidentiary flood that took Lucien down. Some of it simply ceased to exist. Marcus Webb went to prison. He'd cooperated in the end, which shortened the number but didn't erase it, and Adrian visited him once, and it was the last conversation they had, exactly as Adrian had promised on that basement floor. Fitch ran. He was found in a country that had no extradition arrangement and lived out his days looking over his shoulder, which Elena thought was its own sentence. Coyle, the accountant who'd told Adrian the truth when telling the truth was the most dangerous thing he could do, was given a new name and enough money to disappear into an ordinary life, which he did, gratefully, and was never heard from again. Elena took control of the Ashcroft Syndicate. She did it on one condition, stated once, to the assembled leadership of an organization that had operated for over 120 years, and she did not raise her voice when she said it. We have spent a century building the ability to influence without being seen, she said. My grandfather understood that as a discipline. But discipline without purpose is just habit. From now, our influence protects. We move to keep innocent people out of the wars that families like ours start. We use what we have to prevent the kind of night we just survived from happening to anyone else. If that's not a thing you can commit to, this is the moment you leave, and you leave with my respect and no consequence. No one left. She hadn't expected anyone to. Her grandfather had chosen these people carefully, over decades, and she'd inherited not just an organization, but the accumulated judgment of a man who'd spent his life deciding who to trust. She saw Adrian occasionally over those months, practical meetings mostly. There were assets that intersected, relationships that had to be unwound carefully, a great deal of complicated machinery that required both of them to disassemble without anyone getting hurt in the process. They worked well together, which neither of them commented on. They'd always have worked well together, she thought. That had never been the problem. She did not offer him anything, and he did not ask for anything, and there was a strange peace in that. Two people who'd stopped performing for each other, meeting as what they actually were. Then, in the early spring, 7 months after the mountain, he came to the estate. He came without calling. Petra told her he was at the north gate, alone, in an ordinary car, and Elena went to the window of the east sitting room and looked down and saw him standing beside the car, in the flat gray light with his hands empty at his sides, and she stood at that window for a long time before she went down. She met him in the gravel courtyard. He looked healthier than the last time, still thinner than he'd been, and he stood slightly favoring the left side where the lung had been, and probably always would, but he looked like a man who'd found some kind of ground under himself in the months since she'd last seen him. You didn't call, she said. I was afraid you'd tell me not to come. I might have. I know. They stood in the courtyard. A cold wind moved through the trees at the edge of the property, and neither of them moved toward the shelter of the house. He reached into his coat pocket and took something out and held it in his open palm, and she looked at it, and it was a wedding ring. The plain one, the one she'd left on the kitchen counter the morning the convoy came, the one she'd assumed had been thrown away with everything else. You kept it, she said. I found it after, he said, in the apartment. When I finally went back. He looked at the ring in his palm. I've been carrying it around for months trying to decide what it was for. Whether I was keeping it because I wanted something back or because I needed to hold on to the reminder of what I'd been. He closed his hand around it. I figured out it was neither. What is it then? He looked at her. "It's the only honest thing I have," he said. "The whole marriage was me not seeing you. This ring is the one piece of it that's true, because it's the thing you took off when you finally stopped waiting for me to look. It's not a symbol of what we had. It's a symbol of the exact moment I lost you, and I've been carrying it because I don't ever want to forget how easy it was for me to throw away the best thing that ever protected me." Elena was quiet. The wind moved through the trees again. "I'm not here to ask you to take me back," Adrian said. "I don't think that's a thing that can happen, and I don't think I've earned the right to want it. I came to give you this," he held out the ring again, "because it's yours, and because I wanted you to know I understood, finally, what I did. Not the divorce, the 7 years before it. I wanted you to hear me say I know exactly what I destroyed." Elena looked at the ring in his hand. She didn't take it. "Ask me the question," she said. He looked at her uncertain. "There's a question you've never asked me," she said. "You've been standing next to it for 7 years. Ask it now." Adrian was quiet for a moment, and then he understood. "If I'd known who you were," he said slowly, "from the beginning, if I'd known you were an Ashcroft, that you had all that power, all that reach, would I have loved you the same?" "Yes," she said, "that question." He looked at her, and she watched him take the question seriously in a way that the man she'd married never would have. She watched him actually consider it, and refuse the easy answer, and arrive at the truth, even though the truth cost him something. "No," he said. The word landed in the cold air between them. "If I'd known who you were back then, I would have loved your power," he said. "I would have married the Ashcroft name and told myself it was you. I was a man who understood affection as acquisition. My father built that into me, and Lucien reinforced it. And if you'd walked into my life carrying an empire, I'd have wanted the empire and called it love, and I'd never have known the difference." He held her gaze. "That's the honest answer. Back then, I couldn't have loved you. I didn't have the equipment for it." Elena waited. "But that's not the question that matters anymore," he said. "Because I did know who you were, eventually. I found out you were the most powerful person I'd ever stood next to. And I found out you'd spent 7 years protecting me, and I found out you'd walk into a fortress and stand between me and a gun." His voice caught, and he let it, "And none of that is what I love. I don't love the power. I watched the power, and it didn't move me at all." He took a breath that pulled at the healed rib. "What I love is the woman who stayed, who kept keeping me alive after I'd given her every reason to let me die. That's not the Ashcroft heir. That's just you. And I only learned to see her after I'd already lost her, which is the exact punishment I deserve." Elena stood very still. The wind had gone quiet. The gray light lay flat across the courtyard, and the old stone of the house, and the two of them standing in the middle of it, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. "You know what my grandfather wrote," she said finally, "in the letter he left me, at the bottom, after all the instructions about the cash and Lucien and the archive." She looked at the ring in Adrian's open hand. He wrote, "Trust is not given to the strong. It's given to the ones who stayed when they had every reason to go." She reached out. She did not take the ring. She took his hand. The whole hand, the one holding the ring, closing her fingers around his closed fist so that the ring stayed inside, held between them. "I'm not taking the ring back," she said. "The marriage is over. It ended on a kitchen counter, and it's not coming back, and I don't want it back because the woman who wore that ring spent 7 years being invisible, and I'm never going to be invisible again." Adrian's face didn't fall. He nodded, slowly, accepting it. "But I'll take your hand," she said. "Not because you were powerful. You were powerful the whole time, and it never once made me trust you." She held his gaze. "I'll take it because you stepped in front of a bullet before you'd worked out whether it was worth it. Because you took the empire your father and your uncle built on murder, and you tore it down instead of standing on it. Because you carried a ring around for 7 months not to win me back, but to make sure you never forgot what you'd done." She tightened her grip on his hand. "You became someone worth trusting, not the man I married. Someone the man I married could never have become until he lost everything. That's who I'm holding hands with, not who you were, who you turned into when the pretending stopped." Adrian looked down at their joined hands. When he looked back up, his eyes were wet again, and he didn't wipe them, and he didn't look away. "That's more than I deserve," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is. Take it anyway." They walked into the house together, not as a reunited couple, because they were not that and would never be that again, but as two people who had come out the other side of the same catastrophe and found, in the wreckage, something more durable than what they'd had before. Not the romance of two strangers pretending, but the hard-earned trust of two people who had seen each other completely, at their worst and their most desperate, and decided to stay in the room anyway. The Ashcroft estate did not become a home for Adrian Voss. He kept his own place, rebuilt his own life, found his own footing in a world that no longer had an empire in it for him to run. But he came to the estate often, and Elena let him, and over the months and then the years, the coming and the letting became a thing with its own quiet shape. Not a marriage, not a reconciliation of what had broken, but something the two of them built new, on ground that was theirs and no one else's, without a single lie in the foundation. The Ashcroft syndicate went on. Under Elena, it grew quieter and stranger and harder to see, and it moved through the world's crises the way her grandfather had taught her, invisibly, preventing wars that no one ever knew had almost happened, protecting people who would never learn their lives had been kept whole by an organization they'd never heard of. It was not a clean thing, exactly. Nothing in that world was clean. But it was pointed now in a direction her grandfather had only ever hinted at, and Elena carried that direction forward the way she carried everything, completely, carefully, without needing anyone to see her do it. Lucien Voss was tried in 3 jurisdictions and convicted in all of them. He grew old and small in a plain room not unlike the one Elena had visited him in, and he became exactly what she'd promised. Not a legend, not a martyr, just a documented man who'd murdered his brother for a chair. No one told stories about him. That was the point. That had always been the point. And on a gray afternoon at the edge of the following winter, Elena Ashcroft stood at the window of the east sitting room and watched an ordinary car come up the drive and stop at the north gate, and she watched Adrian Voss get out of it, alone, empty-handed, favoring his left side the way he always would now. And she did not feel the old ache, and she did not feel triumph, and she did not feel any of the large dramatic things a person might expect to feel. She felt something quieter and harder to name. She felt the specific peace of having survived the worst version of her life, and come out the other side still herself, only more so. She felt the durable, unglamorous weight of trust that had been earned rather than assumed. She felt the ground under her feet, which was hers, which she had inherited and reshaped, and would one day hand to someone she chose as carefully as her grandfather had chosen her. She went down to meet him. The gates of the Ashcroft estate stood open in the winter light, and the wind moved through the old trees, and two people who had once destroyed each other and then, against every reasonable expectation, learned to be honest, walked together across the gravel toward the house, not because either of them had power over the other, and not because the past had been erased, but because loyalty earned through sacrifice, it turned out, outlasts every empire ever built on fear. The car sat empty at the gate, and behind them the estate closed its doors against the cold, and the long story of two families finally, quietly, came to its end.